Okay, everybody. Welcome to Chapter 9, The Best Years in the Reeves book. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the events that happened kind of after the Red Scare, the beginning of the Cold War, and up until Vietnam. So we had a lot of post-war growth and prosperity. If you look at the numbers, advances in medicine and food kept people alive longer. People started to live past the age of 65, and I think life expectancy is even into the 90s in some instances here. Um, as a result, the population also boomed. That's where we get the term baby boomer. Um, and kind of the birthing of children in a high rate after 1945 up until 1960. People also started to move west. The population of the Pacific states increased by 110%. And by 1963 and up until now, California is the most populous state. So our income also grew. Unemployment at that time was relatively about 5%. And inflation, or what the cost of goods and services are, were going up about 3% or less a year. Um, People had disposable income. So Reeves cites this number, and I don't know if it is he has the same definition of disposable income as I do, but it looked like the disposable income for man, woman, and child was 1845 or 1845. Now I don't know what he really means by this. He doesn't give a good definition of what disposable income is. If you ask me what disposable income is, it is your money minus your bills and the money you have left over to spend on entertainment or to go out or whatever. That's disposable income. So I'm not quite sure if he has the same definition as I do. We also have automation, and labor saving devices increasing productivity and kind of whittling away the need of factory workers. That's one of the reasons that union membership started to go down, was because there was a decreasing need for factory workers, and a lot of those jobs were union tied. So um, that's another reason we've seen a decline in unions. Um, America became a post-industrial society where white-collar workers actually outnumbered blue-collar workers. So if we look at religion, we started to also kind of see a growth in religiosity. Um, Church membership soared to over 100 million in 1955, and then a record up into 49% of people having attended a church or a synagogue in the past week. So you can see that at that time we were a very religious nation. And some stats that reflect that. Eisenhower, who was president, also felt that you needed to inject a little bit more religion into the country. He established the White House prayer breakfast. He sought to establish a national day of prayer and open his cabinet meetings with prayer. The words "God" were under God were added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and the term "the motto in God we trust" became our official motto. So we also had space travel that started to ramp up during that time. NASA was created. Kind of have the United States trying to win the space race, right? We also had defense, and by 1960, intercontinental ballistic missiles were developed that could reach targets from up to 7,000 miles away. And by the early Kennedy years, nearly 300 huge ICBMs were deployed in underground sites across the United States. We had, like I said, a development and advancement of technology, and kind of where we really started to practice that containment theory that the communist world would face massive retaliations if there were any counteraggressions to the United States trying to spread democracy. So another instance that we had here when we were on the brink of World War III in the 60s were that the United States was secretly working through the CIA efforts to assassinate Castro, who was the leader of Cuba at the time, and had turned Cuba into a communist society and a dictatorship. Plans were actually laid to mount an invasion of Cuba using Cuban expatriates, and who were trained by the U.S. turn, we also kind of had the beginning of the Vietnam War. France attempted to reassert its authority over a one-time colony in known as Vietnam. The Vietnamese, who had bitterly fought the Japanese during the war, had sought independence. And the struggle became part of the Cold War because Ho Chi Minh, the popular Vietnamese leader, who was in charge, combined that nationalistic type of spirit that we saw from the Nazis and mix it with communism. And this is where we get the term, where we really start looking at the term the domino theory, right? This was the belief that if one country failed at communism, the neighborhood countries would soon follow suit. Between 1955 and 1961, the United States had poured more than $1 billion into South Vietnam, mostly military aid trying to prevent that spread of communism. And in a sense, too, we also had strained relations with the USSR at the time. Tensions were obviously escalated by the shooting down of a U-2 CIA plane. At that time, Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the head of the Soviet Union at that time, walked out of a peace summit that escalated the Cold War and ran all the way up until 1989. The 1960 presidential election was a very close election. JFK beat Nixon by 112,000 popular votes. Just as close in the Electoral College. And it was the closest election that we've seen until Gore versus Bush in 2000. So, at the time of during his first year of presidency, Kennedy ranked Vietnam as the number one threat to world stability. That corruption, the religious differences, and mounting success by the Viet Cong guerrillas weakened the South Vietnamese government of Ngo Dinh Diem, and Diem was a Catholic, and public protests over the repression of Buddhists threatened the stability of the regime. As a result, Kennedy started to increase foreign aid and military advisors to Vietnam. And on the other side, if we jump back to Cuba, we had talked about that, kind of that prepping of an invasion of Cuba. So we had a bunch of things going on at this time. So if we kind of look at something called the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was what was an assassination attempt to push Castro from power. In 1961, April of 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be a definitive strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who had fled the Cuba earlier when Castro took over. Castro had a lot of advisors and a lot of kind of tipsters on every corner, not just in Cuba, but also in some parts of the United States. He was aware that the attack was coming, so he moved his military out of harm's way. And when at the Bay of Pigs, when the Cuban exiles landed, the CIA wasn't aware that Castro was expecting them. So obviously everything was broadcast over a radio station. During that Bay of Pigs, an unexpected coral reef sank some of the exiled ships as they pulled on the shore. Cuba had pinned the invaders on the beach, and the exiles surrendered. After less than a day of fighting, 114 were killed and 1,100 were taken prisoners. The CIA believed that Kennedy would eventually allow the American military to intervene in Cuba on their behalf. However, Kennedy didn't want to escalate tensions. He didn't want to abandon Cuba to the communists, but he also didn't want to start World War III. And there was still kind of some backlash and maybe some hard feelings from members of the CIA and the government. And in the government, because Kennedy didn't provide air cover for those exiles that were trying to invade Cuba. It's a theory that's one of the reasons that might have led to his assassination, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So we saw the failure at the Bay of Pigs, and then we also had something lead into called the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets began to send troops, weapons, technology into Cuba. And then at the time, there was about 40,000 Russian troops and 270,000 armed Cuban troops there. And remember that the big thing that people get concerned about with Cuba is that it's only 90 miles from Miami. So um, only 90 miles submits is separates the United States and a totalitarian government. Um, so at that time, uh, the Soviet Union had moved some missiles into Cuba and had them pointed at the United States. Soviet Union had said that was a strategic thing, and in turn, the United States, through a Turkish military base, also had missiles pointed at the USSR. So for 13 days, we were on the brink of nuclear war, right? Um, the Kennedy also sought blockade using the Navy to prevent the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment. Um, Eventually, a compromise was worked out. The USSR withdrew from Cuba, and the US removed missiles from Turkey. Now, probably getting up into the last thing, kind of the chapter that ends the Great War, and a lot of things that people kind of see as kind of the fall of Camelot. Um, Assassination. I mean, there's a lot of questions with regards to assassination, and this was one of the times that I'm disappointed that we're not going to meet in person, because I would love to discuss some of the details of JFK's assassination with you and maybe focus on some of the conspiracy theories out there. Remember, the official government record is that Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone shooter, shot Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, from a book depository building on November 22nd, 1963. Now, there is a film called the Zapruder film, and if you have it's not for the faint of heart. So if you have a weak stomach or don't like violent things, there's something called the Zapruder film, which I don't think you should watch. But if you are kind of want to see a kind of in my opinion, a proof that there wasn't a single shooter, is if you watch the Zapruder film, it shows Kennedy getting shot from the front, and his head goes back into the left, instead of forward, like if you would expect getting shot from behind. Now, there's been a lot of conjecture and a lot of stories and a lot of conspiracy theories about this, but I'm not much into conspiracy theories, but I do believe that there were more than one shooters in Dallas in November of 1963. That's just what I think. So if you ever want to dive down a rabbit hole, there is an Oliver Stone movie called JFK that really focuses on this, and there's a bunch of writings and things like that. Books have been written about it, and it's a very, very interesting thing, a very, kind of captivating thing to look at. But, you could probably teach a whole semester about Kennedy conspiracy theories and focus on them. But, it's just kind of also kind of closes out the period where we considered it to be the best years, where we had an economic boom, a bunch of people happy, and then it all ended with the assassination of a popular president, getting into a war that seemed like it would never end, and then an unpopular person becoming president and eventually being close to being impeached before he resigned, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Okay, so that's what I kind of wanted you guys to take out of the best years. All right, we will talk to you soon.